Harold felt sorry for you, Walter. That's the only reason he ever let you near this family. Margaret said it without raising her voice, the way you'd correct a waiter about a wrong order. Nobody at the table moved. The ceiling fan kept turning, its slow mechanical clicking, suddenly the loudest thing in the room. 12 people, 12 place settings, and not one fork touched a plate for 11 full seconds. I counted them, the way I count stress loads in my sleep. Somewhere down the table, a spoon settled into a bowl of applesauce, gentle, apologetic, the only motion anyone dared make. I sat there and understood, finally and completely, that I had spent 14 years being useful to that family, the way a jack stand is useful under a car. Necessary right up until the car is fixed, then rolled back into the corner of the garage to gather dust until it's needed again. Welcome back. If you're new here, this is the channel where quiet men tell you exactly how they stopped being invisible. Hit subscribe, because you don't want to miss what I did 3 days after I walked out of that house. My name is Walter Hines. I'm 64 years old. I've spent 31 years as a structural engineer, the last 19 of them inspecting bridges and load-bearing walls for the state. The guy they call when a building groans in a way nobody likes. I've been married to Diane for 14 years, second marriage for both of us, the good kind. The kind you build slow and careful because you already know how fast the fast kind can collapse. In those 14 years, I rebuilt the porch steps at the family cabin twice, replumbed the guest bathroom, and drove Diane's niece Lily to 3 different colleges for campus tours because nobody else had a Saturday free. 14 Thanksgivings. 14 years of being the son-in-law who showed up early and left late and never once asked for anything back. I'd stopped counting the favors around year 8. I want you to know all that, briefly, because it matters for what comes next. And because I promise I won't dwell on it the way some men do. I learned a long time ago that a list of sacrifices is just a resume nobody asked for. I need to tell you something about myself before I tell you about that dinner table, because if I don't, the rest of this won't make sense. There's a thing I do, a small thing, that Diane noticed on our 3rd date and never mentioned again until years later. When a room turns cold, when somebody says something cutting and aimed, I check my watch. Not because I care what time it is. It's a nervous habit from childhood, from a father who ran a demolition crew and measured his sons by how much we could carry without complaining. I check my watch, and then I go quiet. And I stay quiet for exactly as long as it takes the humiliation to pass through me like weather. Diane used to think it meant I didn't feel things. It took her years to understand it meant the opposite. I feel everything. I just measured it, cataloged it, filed it away, the way I file every crack I find in a beam before I decide whether it's cosmetic or load-bearing. That habit would matter later. Hold on to it. Diane's father, Harold, was the reason I kept coming back to that lake house year after year, long after I'd stopped expecting warmth from anyone else in that family. Harold Whitcomb built the cabin himself in 1979, board by board, on a stretch of shoreline in the Adirondacks that had been in his family since his own father's time. He was a quiet man, sharp-eyed, the kind who noticed things other people missed, and said nothing about most of them. The first summer I came up to that lake, a newly married man still learning the terrain of his wife's family, Harold found me on the dock at 6 in the morning, alone, and instead of small talk he asked me to look at a soft spot in the boathouse floor. I got down on my knees in my good pants and told him honestly it wasn't rot. It was a shifted joist, an easy fix, nothing to lose sleep over. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Most men would have told me what I wanted to hear. We didn't become close men who called each other on birthdays. We became something rarer, 2 quiet men who trusted each other's judgment without needing to say so out loud. Over the years I fixed that boathouse floor twice more as the lake ate at the pilings, reinforced the cabin's north wall after a bad winter, and every single time Harold would stand a few feet back, hands in his pockets, and watch, the way you watch someone do a job right. Harold died 2 years ago, heart sudden, no warning, no long goodbye. I still think about the last thing he said to me 6 weeks before, standing in the workshop attached to the cabin while I helped him rewire a light fixture that had been sparking. He wasn't a sentimental man, so when he got quiet and serious, I knew to listen. Walter, he said, not looking at me, focused on a wire nut in his hands. If anything ever happens where they try to shut you out of this place, and I mean if not when, though I've got my worries, there's a floorboard under the workbench, third one from the wall, loose on the left side. Don't ask me why I'm telling you this instead of my own son. You already know why. I didn't ask him to explain further, and he didn't offer. I told myself it was an old man being cautious about nothing, the way men his age sometimes got when they started thinking about what they'd leave behind. I didn't think about it again for 2 years. I want to be honest with you. Even after he said it, I never once lifted that floorboard. That wasn't who I was. I respected boundaries even when they were handed to me pre-drawn. That respect, that patience, is going to sound like a virtue for most of this story. Stay with me, because eventually it becomes the thing I regret. Margaret, Harold's widow, is a different kind of person entirely, polished where Harold was plain, performative where he was quiet. In the 2 years since Harold died, grief had done something strange to her. It hadn't softened her. It had sharpened her, given her a hunger for control that Harold's steady presence used to keep in check. She started talking about the cabin differently, calling it a burden none of us asked for, floating the idea of selling it at Thanksgiving the year after the funeral, watching everyone's faces while she said it, gauging reactions like a woman testing water temperature with her toe. Preston, Diane's older brother, was exactly the kind of son who benefits from a mother like that. 38 years old, 3 failed business ventures behind him, each one funded partly by Harold and cleaned up afterward by nobody in particular because nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Preston had a way of standing in rooms like he already owned them. His fiancée, Vanessa, had appeared 18 months earlier, sleek and quick smiling, always somehow present whenever money got discussed, always somehow absent whenever dishes needed washing. And then there was Lily, Diane's younger sister, 31, a school teacher. The only Whitcomb besides Harold who ever looked at me like I was a person instead of a fixture. Lily used to sit next to me at family dinners the way a lifeguard sits near the deep end, not because she expected trouble every time, but because when trouble came, she wanted to be close enough to do something about it. This reunion, the one I'm telling you about, was supposed to be different. It was the second anniversary of Harold's death, and Margaret had decided, abruptly, the way she decided most things now, that the whole family should gather at the cabin to honor him properly, her words. Diane had been quietly hopeful about it for weeks. She missed her father in a way she rarely said out loud, and some small part of her, I think, hoped that grief might have finally softened her mother into someone gentler. I should have recognized that hope for what it was. Diane had been hoping the same thing for 2 years and getting disappointed every single time. We drove up on a Thursday evening in July, 6 hours from the city. The last hour along a dirt road that always made Diane roll her window down no matter the weather, chasing the smell of pine and lake water she'd grown up with. She reached over at one point and put her hand on my knee, the way she used to when we were newly married, and said, "I think this weekend's going to be good, Walter. I can feel it." I told her I hoped so. I meant it. I want that on the record, because everything that follows is easier to understand if you know I arrived at that cabin wanting, genuinely, for things to go well. They did not go well. Friday morning, breakfast on the screened porch overlooking the water. Margaret had made her usual spread. Eggs, that thick-cut bacon Harold used to buy from the butcher 2 towns over, biscuits from a recipe she guarded like a state secret. She circled the table with the coffee pot, filling cups. Preston, Vanessa, Diane, Lily. She skipped mine entirely and set the pot down on the sideboard, already turning to ask Preston about his newest opportunity, some import business he was starting with money he didn't have yet. I got up without a word and poured my own cup. Lily's eyes tracked the whole thing. She didn't say anything either, not that morning. Neither did I. I checked my watch. 6:41. I filed it away. Saturday, the weather held clear and warm, and the men gathered on the dock in the after-lunch heat while the women cleared dishes inside. Preston was talking about the cabin's aging dock pilings, how they'd need replacing eventually. When Margaret came out to join us, holding her coffee, and mentioned that the whole north wall of the boathouse, The one I'd reinforced myself twice, had a soft spot again, and did anyone know a contractor? I built that wall, Margaret, I said. Twice, actually. I can look at it this afternoon if you want. She smiled at me the way you smile at a child who's offered to help with something clearly beyond them. I think we should get someone certified to look at it, Walter. No offense. It's a big property. We should be careful. I have 31 years of state certification hanging on my office wall. I said nothing about that. I said, sure, whatever you think's best. Preston smirked into his beer. I checked my watch. 2:17, filed it away. That evening, dinner was set up outside on the long table under the string lights Harold had put up himself the summer before he died. Lights that Margaret still turned on every night like a ritual none of us were allowed to question. The conversation moved the way these conversations do. Preston's business, Vanessa's opinions about it, property values on the lake, who was and wasn't invited to somebody's wedding. I ate my dinner and stayed out of it, the way I'd learned to over 14 years of these gatherings. Then Preston turned his attention to me, loud enough that the whole table shifted. So, Walter, Diane says you're still doing the bridge thing. Still doing the bridge thing, I agreed. Must be nice, he said, getting paid by the government to walk around and poke at concrete. Vanessa laughed, a light, practiced sound. That's basically retirement with extra steps, right? I've spent 3 decades keeping people alive, who drive over water they never think twice about. I've stood under a highway overpass at 2 in the morning with a flashlight, because a trucker reported a sound nobody else could hear, and found the hairline fracture that would have taken that overpass down inside a year. I said none of that. I said something like that and reached for my water glass. Diane, across the table, was cutting her chicken. She had heard every word. She kept cutting. I didn't know it yet. But that silence, Diane's fork moving steadily through a piece of chicken, while her family took turns diminishing me, was the last time I'd let a silence like that pass without consequence. I want to be honest with you, though. In the moment, I didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter and colder settling into place, the particular stillness of a man doing math he doesn't want to do. I checked my watch, 7:04. I didn't file that one away so easily. Sunday morning, the actual anniversary, started deceptively gentle. Margaret had arranged a small remembrance by the water, a few photos of Harold propped on a folding table, his old fishing hat set beside them, a candle nobody would be able to keep lit in the lake breeze. For about 20 minutes, standing there while Margaret read a poem in a voice thick with performed grief, I let myself believe the weekend might still turn a corner. It turned, instead, into the worst version of itself an hour later, after lunch, when I was helping Preston fold up the tables we'd used for the remembrance. Margaret found me by the shed, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a woman who had been building towards something all weekend and had finally decided the moment had come. Walter, she said, I think it's time we're honest with each other. I set down the folding table I was carrying. All right, Harold's gone. This family needs to think about the future now, about what's best for all of us. She let that sit. Preston and I have been talking. It doesn't make sense for the cabin to just sit here, half-used, with all of us scattered around the country. We're going to look into selling it. I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the cabin's market value, and everything to do with the sound of Harold's voice in that workshop 2 years earlier. Don't ask me why I'm telling you this instead of my own son. You already know why. I hadn't understood it then. I was beginning to understand it now. Does Diane know? I asked. Diane will understand when it's explained to her properly. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. This doesn't really concern you anyway, Walter. You're not blood. 14 years, 14 Thanksgivings, 2 rebuilt boathouse floors and a reinforced north wall and 100 small favors nobody remembered because remembering wasn't required of them. You're not blood. I checked my watch. 12 minutes past 1. I did not file that one away at all. I carried it with me for the rest of the afternoon like a stone in my shoe, and by the time the whole family gathered on the porch 2 hours later, I would learn, because Margaret had decided the weekend needed a proper conclusion, a clearing of the air. Her words again, I already knew. Somewhere underneath the calm I was still managing to hold on to, that something in me had finished bending and started breaking. Margaret stood in the center of that porch with an iced tea in her hand she never once drank from, a prop, something to occupy her fingers. Diane stood beside her, and I noticed, the way I notice hairline cracks in concrete, the kind of noticing you can't switch off even when you want to, that Diane's shoulder was angled a few degrees toward her mother and away from me. "Walter," Margaret said, and the whole porch went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone already knows what's coming and nobody wants to be the one who flinches first. "I think we need to clear the air before everyone heads home." And that's when she said it. The line I opened this story with. The line I will remember for the rest of my life, delivered as casually as a woman correcting an order at a restaurant. "Harold felt sorry for you, Walter. That's the only reason he ever let you near this family." I looked at Diane. She was looking at the floorboards of the porch her father had built with his own hands. The same porch where I'd fixed 3 loose boards 2 summers ago, while Harold sat in his chair and told me, unprompted, that I was the only person in this family he trusted to do a job without cutting corners. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I checked my watch. 4:19 in the afternoon, and for the first time in 14 years, I didn't file it away. I let myself feel the full weight of it, right there in front of everyone, and something in my chest that had been holding steady under 31 years of pressure finally, quietly, gave. I stood there on that porch, still holding the weight of Margaret's sentence, and I want to tell you what happened in the 6 seconds after she said it, because those 6 seconds mattered more than almost anything else that weekend. Nobody moved. Preston looked down at his drink. Vanessa found something fascinating in the tree line. Lily's hand came up to her mouth, not dramatically, just a small, involuntary gesture, the kind you make when you watch something break that you'd hoped might hold. And Diane looked at me finally, and in her eyes I saw not defense, not even discomfort, but a kind of exhausted resignation, as if some part of her had already decided this conversation was inevitable and was simply relieved it had finally arrived. "That's not true," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "And you know it isn't." Margaret's chin lifted a fraction. "Harold was a generous man. He let a lot of people close to this family who didn't necessarily belong here. It doesn't make you family, Walter. It never did. He built that boathouse floor with rod I fixed twice," I said. "He asked my opinion on things he never asked Preston's. He trusted my judgment because I earned it, the same way I earn everything, by showing up and doing the work. If you want to stand here and tell me he only tolerated me out of pity, you're not talking about the man I knew. You're talking about someone you've invented because it's easier than admitting he trusted me, more than he trusted his own son." Preston's jaw tightened. "Watch it. I've watched it for 14 years, Preston," I said, and I felt something in my own voice that I didn't fully recognize. Not anger exactly, something colder and more finished than anger. "I've watched all of it." Margaret set her iced tea down on the porch railing with a small, deliberate click, the kind of sound a woman makes when she wants you to know a decision has been made. "I think," she said, "given how you're speaking to me right now, in my own home, on the anniversary of my husband's death, it might be best if you left. I won't have this kind of disrespect at Harold's memorial." There it was. The ultimatum, dressed up as grief, dressed up as propriety, the same move she'd been making in smaller ways all weekend, finally spoken plainly. I looked at Diane one more time, gave her the space to say something, anything, a single word in my defense, after 14 years of dinners, where I'd defended people who wouldn't have crossed the street for me. She didn't say anything. She looked at the floor. I want to be honest with you about what happened inside me in that moment, because it wasn't the clean, cinematic anger you see in movies. It was quieter than that, and stranger. I felt my hand go, without my permission, to my wrist, to check my watch. That old tell, the one Diane used to think meant I didn't feel things, 4:26. And then, for the first time in as long as I could remember, the habit failed me. I didn't file it away. I didn't wait for the feeling to pass through me like weather. I stood there on that porch, in front of 12 people who had spent an entire weekend, making it clear I didn't belong to them, and I let myself simply feel the whole shape of it, unfiltered, for maybe 4 full seconds. It was the loneliest 4 seconds of my adult life. I'm not ashamed to tell you that. All right, I said, I'll go. I walked past Margaret, past Preston, past Vanessa's carefully neutral expression, and into the cabin. I didn't slam the screen door. I want that noted because I think it matters. I didn't give any of them the satisfaction of a scene. I went to the guest room Diane and I had shared for 14 summers, and I started folding clothes into my bag with the same steady, unhurried precision I use when I'm packing tools for a job site. Fold, place, fold, place. My hands needed something to do that made sense. Lily found me there 4 minutes later. She didn't knock, just appeared in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't cold. Walter. Her voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. You don't have to go. Nobody actually wants you to go. It's just. She stopped, because we both knew that wasn't quite true, or at least wasn't true enough to finish the sentence. It's okay. Lily, I said, and meant it, mostly. I'm not upset with you. I want you to know that specifically. You've been kinder to me in 14 years than the rest of this family combined, and I see it, even when I don't say so. Her eyes went glassy. This isn't fair. No, I agreed. It isn't. She crossed the room and hugged me, tight, unexpected, the kind of hug that catches you off guard because it's not performative. It's just a person needing to hold on to something steady for a second before it walks out the door. I hugged her back. I want to tell you that hug meant more to me in that moment than almost anything anyone had said to me all weekend, because it was the one piece of physical, unguarded honesty in an entire house full of careful, calculated distance. Two people who don't usually reaching for each other anyway, because the moment demanded it and pretense finally ran out of road. Tell Diane I started and then stopped because I genuinely didn't know how to finish that sentence. Tell her yourself, Lily said, pulling back, wiping her eyes with the heel of her hand. She's not going to come find me before I leave. Lily didn't argue with that. She just looked at me, and in her silence was the confirmation I already knew was coming. I picked up my bag. And then, because some instinct I didn't fully understand pulled me there, I walked out through the kitchen and across the gravel path to the workshop instead of straight to the car. The workshop still smelled the way it always had. Sawdust, motor oil, the particular mustiness of a wooden building that stood through 50 New York winters. Harold's tools still hung on their pegboard exactly where he'd left them, outlined in faded marker, so you'd always know where each one belonged. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish, feeling like a man chasing a half-remembered instruction from a conversation 2 years old that might have meant nothing at all. Then I got down on my knees in front of the workbench, the same way I'd gotten down on my knees on a dock 20-plus years earlier in my good pants to check a soft spot in a boathouse floor, and I found the third floorboard from the wall, loose on the left side, exactly as Harold had said. Underneath it was a small metal fireproof box, the kind you buy for important documents, dusty but dry, undisturbed. I sat back on my heels and looked at it for a long moment before I opened it. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name on it, in Harold's handwriting, blocky and deliberate. An engineer's handwriting, even though he'd never been one. Underneath the envelope were several folded documents I didn't read yet, and underneath those, wrapped in a soft cloth, was Harold's old pocket watch, the one he'd worn every day of his life that I ever knew him, the one I'd always assumed would go to Preston. I didn't open the envelope right there in the workshop. I want to be honest about why. I was afraid of what it would ask of me, and some part of me, even in that moment, was still trying to be a man who respected boundaries, even boundaries that had just been handed to him by a dead man from beyond a floorboard. I closed the box, tucked it under my arm, and walked to the car. Deanne was standing near the porch steps when I came around the side of the cabin, arms crossed against the early evening chill coming off the lake. She saw the box under my arm, and her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe, or the first thin edge of alarm. What is that? Something your father left me, I said. I'll explain when you're ready to actually listen. Walter, please, don't do this. Not today, not like this. I stopped, because some part of me still wanted to. 14 years doesn't disappear in an afternoon, no matter how ugly the afternoon gets. Diane, I said, your mother just told me, in front of your entire family, that your father only tolerated me out of pity. And you stood there and looked at the floor. I've spent 14 years driving 6 hours every summer to fix things in a house that apparently was never mine to fix. I think I've earned an afternoon where I don't have to pretend that's fine. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say, she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, the closest thing to honesty I'd get from her that day. That's the problem, I said gently, because I didn't want to be cruel. Even then, you never do. I put the box in the trunk beside my bag and drove away from that lake house without looking in the rearview mirror. Not for effect, I simply didn't need to. I already knew nobody was coming after me. The drive back toward the city took 6 hours, most of it in a silence so complete I could hear my own thoughts arranging themselves into some kind of order for the first time all weekend. Somewhere around hour 2, at a gas station outside a small town whose name I don't remember, I finally opened the envelope. Harold's handwriting filled 2 pages, dense and careful. He wrote about watching me on that dock the first summer I came into the family, about how he'd decided, somewhere in that first hour, that I was a man who told the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. A rarer quality, he wrote, than people think, and one his own son had never once demonstrated. He wrote that he'd watched, over the years, how Margaret and Preston treated me, and that it had troubled him more than he ever said out loud, because saying it out loud, in his experience, only made people dig in harder. He wrote that he'd changed the trust documents for the cabin 2 years before he died, quietly through his own attorney, naming me, not Preston, not Margaret, as sole trustee, with instructions that the property couldn't be sold or transferred without my signature. He wrote that he hadn't told me while he was alive, because he didn't want me carrying that weight while he was still around, to carry it himself, and because some part of him hoped he'd never actually need the arrangement to matter. If you're reading this, the letter said near the end, it's because they finally showed you who they really are, and I am sorrier about that than I know how to say. I didn't leave you in charge of this place because I felt sorry for you, Walter. I left it with you because you were the only person in this family who ever earned the right to be trusted with something that mattered to me. I sat in that gas station parking lot for a long time after I finished reading. I'm not going to pretend I didn't cry. I did, quietly, the way I do most things, and then I folded the letter carefully back into its envelope, put the car in drive, and kept going. I didn't call Diane. I didn't call Margaret or Preston or answer any of the texts that had started arriving somewhere around hour 3. Diane's, mostly, escalating from, "Where are you going to? Please just talk to me," to, finally, near hour 5, a single word, "Please." I read that last one at a red light and felt exactly how little weight it carried. Not fear in it, not real sorrow, just the particular flatness of someone who expected a problem to solve itself if she waited long enough. I got home a little after 10 that night and called my attorney the next morning. I'd worked with her years earlier on a boundary dispute involving my late first wife's estate, and she was, if nothing else, thorough. I told her everything: Harold's letter, the trust documents, the box, 14 years of favors nobody remembered. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. "Walter," she said finally, "if these documents are what you're describing, and Harold executed them properly through his own attorney 2 years ago, then legally speaking nobody can sell that cabin without your signature. Not Margaret. Not Preston. Nobody. I don't want to be cruel about this," I told her, and I meant it. I don't want to punish anyone. I just don't want that cabin sold out from under Harold's memory to fund one of Preston's business ventures. Then we verify the documents are legitimate and enforceable, and we make sure that when this comes to light, it comes to light the right way. Properly witnessed. Properly filed. No surprises that could be challenged later. I spent that first day back doing something I hadn't expected, not plotting, not scheming, just quietly confirming, through Harold's own attorney, a man named Elliot Marsh who'd handled Harold's affairs for 20 years, that everything in the box was exactly what Harold's letter said it was. Elliot remembered drafting the amendment 2 years earlier. He remembered Harold's exact words, in fact, when he'd signed it. My son will understand eventually. My wife might not, but Walter will do right by this place, and that's what matters to me. 3 days after I drove away from that lake house on a Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was Lily. "Walter," she said, and I could hear something strange in her voice, somewhere between disbelief and barely restrained laughter. "You need to hear this. Mom hired a real estate agent yesterday, started the paperwork to list the cabin, and this morning the agent called her back and said there's a problem with the title." "Is that right?" I said. "Walter." Her voice dropped lower. "What did my grandfather give you in that box?" I told her plainly, without embellishment, because Lily had earned honesty from me the same way Harold once had. There was a long silence on the line. "They have no idea, do they?" she finally said. "They have absolutely no idea what's coming." I looked out my kitchen window at the quiet Wednesday afternoon light, and, for the first time since that porch, since Margaret's voice cutting through 14 years like it was nothing, I felt something settle in my chest that wasn't anger and wasn't grief. It was simply certainty. Harold had trusted me with something that mattered. I intended to honor that trust the right way. Carefully, legally, without cruelty, but without apology either. "No," I told Lily. "They don't, but they're about to." The weeks that followed moved slower than I expected. I'd assumed naively, maybe, that once the title problem surfaced, Margaret would simply back down, embarrassed, and the whole ugly business would quietly resolve itself. That's not what happened. Instead, through Lily, and later through a strange, unexpected phone call from Preston himself, I learned that Margaret had gotten angrier, not smaller, and that the anger had a shape I hadn't anticipated. His name was Gerald Voss. Margaret had met him about 8 months after Harold died. At a grief support group, Lily had encouraged her to attend, and in the year since, he'd become a fixture at family gatherings, always introduced as a dear friend, always somehow present at exactly the moments when money came up. He billed himself as a real estate consultant, sharp-suited, silver-templed, with the practiced warmth of a man who'd learned exactly how to make lonely widows feel seen. I hadn't thought much about him before the reunion. He'd been at the edges of things, pleasant, forgettable. He was not forgettable to Elliot Marsh, Harold's attorney, once I mentioned the name. "Gerald Voss," Elliot said, when I called him a week and a half after Lily's phone call, "worked for a development firm out of Albany about 6 years ago. Lakeshore Capital Partners. They tried to acquire 3 properties on that same stretch of shoreline your father-in-law's cabin sits on. Buy them cheap from grieving families, bundle the parcels, sell the whole thing to a resort developer. Harold turned them down flat when they came to him directly. I remember it because he was furious about the tactics they used. High-pressure calls, manufactured urgency, making elderly widows feel like they had no other option." I sat with that for a long moment. "You're telling me Margaret's boyfriend used to work for the company that tried to buy Harold's land out from under him?" "I'm telling you I think it's worth finding out whether he still does," Elliot said, quietly, "through legitimate channels. A property record search, public filings, nothing that requires anything you shouldn't have access to." It didn't take long. Lakeshore Capital Partners had rebranded 2 years earlier under a different name. Voss listed as a senior acquisitions consultant on their own public website, a fact anyone could have found with an afternoon and a search engine. Margaret, as far as I could tell, had never once looked. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Margaret was some kind of criminal mastermind, and I don't think painting her that way would be honest. I think she was a grieving, controlling woman who'd spent 2 years feeling unmoored without Harold's steadiness to lean on, and Gerald Voss had found her exactly where that unmooring left her softest. Flattered, listened to, made to feel important in a way her own children rarely managed. He hadn't manufactured her contempt for me. That was hers, earned over 14 years of small dismissals that had nothing to do with him. But the push to sell the cabin quickly, quietly, before anyone thought too hard about the paperwork, that had his fingerprints all over it. And I don't believe Margaret ever fully understood she was being used until it was laid out in front of her. I told Diane none of this directly. I want to be honest about that too. Some part of me still wasn't ready to talk to her, not after that porch, not after the floor she'd studied so intently while her mother tore into me. But Lily talked to her, and 2.5 weeks after I'd driven away from that lake house, Diane called me for the first time since that single word text, please, that I'd read at a red light and felt so little in. Walter, she said, and her voice was different than I remembered it being in a long time, smaller, less certain. Lily told me some of it, about Dad's letter, about Gerald. I wasn't hiding it from you, I said. I just wasn't ready to be the one who told you. I know. A long pause. I've been thinking about that porch every day since you left, about the floor. I keep asking myself why I looked at the floor instead of at you. Her breath caught, unsteady. I don't have a good answer, Walter. I think I've spent so many years managing my mother's moods that I forgot how to stand next to someone instead of trying to keep the peace. I let her make you invisible, because making you invisible was easier than making her angry. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. I didn't say anything for a moment. I want to tell you, I felt a rush of forgiveness, warm and immediate. But that's not quite honest either. What I felt was something more complicated. Recognition, maybe, that the woman on the other end of the phone was finally looking at something she'd spent 14 years avoiding, and that the looking itself was costing her something. I need you to understand something, I finally said. I'm not doing this to hurt your mother. I'm not doing it for revenge, whatever it might look like from the outside. I'm doing it because your father trusted me with something, and I intend to honor that, carefully and legally, whether or not it's comfortable for anyone. I know, Diane said. I believe you. I think that's part of why I'm calling. There's a memorial gathering my mother's planning for the 1-year anniversary of the day Dad's ashes were scattered. It's in 3 weeks at the cabin. She doesn't know I know about the title problem yet. I think if you're willing, that might be the right place, not to embarrass her, just to make it real, in front of the people who should have protected you and didn't. I thought about Harold's letter, folded now in a drawer in my home office. The words I didn't leave it with you because I felt sorry for you sitting somewhere behind my eyes every time I closed them. I thought about the boathouse floor, the north wall, 14 Thanksgivings, the coffee cup that got skipped, the word Margaret had used on that porch, like it settled something. Pity. All right, I said. The memorial. But we do it the right way, Diane. Nobody gets ambushed with anything that isn't already verified and legal. I'm not interested in a spectacle. I'm interested in the truth finally being allowed in the room. That's fair, she said. That's more than fair. I want to tell you about the 3 weeks between that phone call and the memorial, because they weren't quiet weeks, even though very little of consequence seemed to happen on the surface. Elliot finalized everything, had the trust documents independently reviewed by a second attorney, confirmed with the county records office that the amendment Harold made 2 years earlier was properly filed and unimpeachable, and drafted a simple, factual letter that could, if necessary, be shown to anyone who doubted the paperwork. He was firm with me about one thing in particular. Walter, whatever gets said at that gathering, you don't read financial figures at people like a prosecutor delivering a verdict. You let the documents speak through me, or through a copy in someone's hands if it comes to that. You're not trying to win. You're trying to be understood. I held on to that. I also, during those 3 weeks, found myself doing something I hadn't expected, reaching out, quietly, to a handful of people from my professional life. Men and women I'd mentored over the years, engineers I'd trained, a foreman named Ruth Okafor, whose apprenticeship I'd fought to get funded 15 years earlier, when nobody else thought a woman belonged on a bridge inspection crew. I didn't ask any of them to come to the memorial. I mentioned it, in passing, the way you mention something that's been sitting heavy on you, and then let it go. I want you to remember that, because it matters for what happened next. The morning of the memorial arrived warm and still, the lake flat as glass the way it sometimes gets in early September before the weather turns. I drove up alone. Diane had gone ahead 2 days earlier to help her mother prepare, and I brought 2 things with me. Harold's letter, in its original envelope, and the fireproof box, closed, sitting on the passenger seat, like a passenger of its own. The gathering was smaller than the reunion had been, maybe 20 people instead of 30, mostly immediate family and a handful of Harold's old friends from town. Margaret had set up the same folding table from the anniversary weekend, photos of Harold arranged carefully, his fishing hat back in its spot of honor. She saw me arrive, and her face did something complicated, surprise, then a kind of brittle composure sliding back into place. "Walter," she said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I loved Harold, too," I said simply, and meant every word of it. I wasn't going to miss this. Gerald Voss stood near Margaret's elbow in a blazer too well tailored for a lakeside memorial, and when his eyes found mine across the gathering, something in his expression flickered, just briefly, before smoothing back into professional pleasantness. I understood in that moment that he recognized exactly what my presence might mean, even if he didn't yet know how much I knew. The remembrance itself was simple and, for the first 20 minutes, genuinely moving. Preston spoke a little, awkwardly, about fishing trips with his father as a boy. Lily read a short passage from a book Harold used to keep by his reading chair. Diane stood near me, her hand finding mine at one point, holding on in a way that felt like an apology and a request at the same time. It was after the remembrance, during the informal gathering that followed, drinks and quiet conversation drifting across the lawn, that Margaret made her mistake, though I don't think she understood it as one at the time. She pulled me aside, near the same shed where she'd told me, weeks earlier, that I wasn't blood, and this time her voice was different, brisk and businesslike. "Walter, I know things have been tense," she said, "but I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate honesty. There's some kind of hold on the cabin's title. My agent can't explain it. Elliot's office has been vague with me. I assume, given everything, that you might know something about this." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the letter in the envelope, about Harold's blocky, deliberate handwriting, about 14 years of coffee cups and boathouse floors, and a porch where a woman I'd trusted told an entire family I'd only ever been tolerated out of pity. "I know everything about it, Margaret," I said. "Your husband changed the trust 2 years before he died. He named me as sole trustee of this property. Nothing can be sold, transferred, or encumbered without my signature. I have the original documents. Elliot has confirmed them independently, and they've been properly filed with the county for 2 years." Margaret's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Disbelief, then something like calculation, then finally anger. "That's not possible. Harold would have told me." "He told me instead," I said, as gently as I could manage. "I've spent a long time trying to understand why, and I think, if you're honest with yourself, you already know." Her voice rose, sharp enough that heads began turning across the lawn. "This is absurd. You expect me to believe my own husband cut his wife and son out of decisions about our family's property to hand control to the man who fixes our gutters?" "Harold felt sorry for you, Walter," she'd said on that porch, weeks earlier, in front of everyone. I thought of that sentence now, standing here with the truth folded in an envelope in my jacket pocket, and I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that this was the moment. Not for cruelty, for honesty. "He didn't feel sorry for me, Margaret," I said, loud enough now that the gathering had gone quiet around us, drawn by the rising tension the way any crowd is drawn to a room, suddenly holding its breath. "He trusted me. There's a difference, and I think some part of you has always known which one it was, even when it was easier to say the other one out loud." Gerald Voss stepped closer, his professional smile fully back in place. "Margaret, perhaps we should discuss this privately, away from—" "Actually," I said, turning to him directly, "I think it's worth mentioning, since you're here, that 6 years ago you worked for Lakeshore Capital Partners, the same firm that tried to pressure Harold into selling this exact stretch of shoreline before he ever met you." He turned them down. Told his attorney it was one of the ugliest sales pitches he'd ever sat through. I wonder if Margaret knows that. The color drained slowly from Gerald's face. Margaret turned to look at him, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Not embarrassment yet, but the first cold edge of suspicion. "Gerald," she said slowly, "is that true?" "Margaret, it's not what it—" "Is it true?" she said again. And there was nothing brittle in her voice now, only a hard, dangerous clarity. It was Preston, of all people, who spoke next, stepping forward from the crowd that had gathered without any of us, quite noticing how large it had grown. I looked him up 2 weeks ago, Preston said, and his voice was shaking slightly, whether from anger or humiliation I couldn't tell. After Lily told me what Walter found, I didn't say anything because I didn't want to believe it either, Mom. But it's on their own website. He never left that firm. He just started using different letterhead. I hadn't expected Preston to be the one to say it. I want to be honest about that. I'd spent 14 years writing him off, quietly, the way you write off a man who's never once given you a reason not to, and here he was, cracking his own mother's certainty open in front of everyone because, apparently, some part of him had been paying closer attention than I'd given him credit for. Margaret turned back to Gerald, and whatever she saw in his face in that moment, the flicker of a man calculating his exit rather than defending his innocence, finished the job I hadn't intended to finish so completely. He left within the hour, murmuring something about a prior commitment, and nobody stopped him. I take no pleasure in telling you that. I watched a lonely woman's face fall apart in slow motion, and even after everything, even after pity and a floor she'd made her daughter study instead of my face, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, and a little sad the way you feel finishing a job you know needed doing but never enjoyed. It was Diane who moved next. And this is the part I want you to understand mattered more to me than anything Elliot's paperwork ever could have accomplished. She stepped forward, in front of her mother, in front of the whole gathering, and said, clearly, without a single tremor in her voice, "Mom, I need to say something, and I need to say it now, in front of everyone, because I didn't say it when it mattered, and I'm not making that mistake twice." Margaret stared at her daughter like she was seeing a stranger. "Diane, you called Walter a burden this family only tolerated," Diane said. "You said it in front of 30 people at that reunion, and I stood there and looked at the floor instead of standing next to my husband. That's on me. I own that. But I will not do it again. Walter has spent 14 years being the most honest, steady person in this family, and every one of you, including me, treated that honesty like something to take for granted instead of something to protect. Dad saw what none of the rest of us were willing to see. I'm ashamed it took me this long to see it too." There was a stillness after that, the kind that settles over a lawn full of people who've just watched something true happen in public. And then, from the edge of the gathering, near the tree line, where the guests from town had been quietly clustered, a small group I hadn't fully registered until that moment began walking forward, Ruth Okafor among them, along with 2 other engineers I'd worked alongside for years, 5 or 6 people total, none of whom I'd invited, none of whom said a single word. They simply came and stood near me, a quiet wall of people who'd shown up because I mattered to them, without being asked, without fanfare. I felt something in my chest give way, differently this time than it had on that porch weeks earlier. Not breaking. Something closer to being held. It was Lily's daughter, 6 years old, who broke the silence a moment later, tugging on her mother's sleeve and asking, in the clear, unfiltered voice only a child can manage in a moment like that, "Mommy, if Grandpa trusted Walter the most, why did everybody act like they didn't?" Nobody answered her right away. I don't think any of us had a good answer. I certainly didn't. Not one I was proud of. But I found myself crouching down slightly, to her level, and saying, as honestly as I could, sometimes people find it easier to be unkind to someone patient than to someone who fights back. It doesn't mean the patient person doesn't notice. It just means it takes longer for everyone else to notice too. She considered that with the serious, uncomplicated attention only children give to things adults have spent years avoiding, and said simply, "That's not fair," which was, I think, the truest sentence spoken on that lawn all day. I want to pause here and tell you something honest about myself, something I hadn't said out loud to anyone, not even Diane, not even in the weeks of phone calls that had slowly rebuilt something fragile between us. Later that afternoon, after Margaret had retreated inside, after the crowd had thinned to just family, Diane and I sat together on the same dock where I'd once knelt in my good pants to check a soft spot in the floor for a man I barely knew yet. "I owe you an admission," I told her. "Not about any of this. About something older." She waited. When your father died, I never told you how much it hurt me, I said. I let you grieve alone, mostly because I didn't want to compete with your grief with my own, and I told myself that was generous of me. It wasn't. It was easier. I've spent our whole marriage doing that, going quiet instead of showing you what I actually feel, checking my say watch instead of saying the hard thing out loud. I let this family treat me like furniture for 14 years, partly because some part of me was comfortable being invisible. It was safer than asking to be seen and being told no. I should have said something a long time before that porch. I own that too. Diane didn't say anything for a moment. Then she took my hand, the way she used to on the drive up to that cabin every summer, and said, "Maybe we both finally learned the same lesson a little too late to save us the pain of learning it." "Maybe," I said, "but not too late to do something with it." Before we left the dock that evening, Diane asked if I'd be willing to do one more thing before the family dispersed for the night. Read a portion of her father's letter aloud to whoever wanted to stay and listen, so that his words could belong to more than just the two of us. I thought about it for a long moment, turning the fireproof box over in my hands, and then I said yes, because I understood by then that Harold hadn't written that letter only for me. He'd written it in some quiet way for exactly this moment, for the day his family might finally need to hear the truth of what he thought, plainly, without anyone left to soften it or spin it into something more convenient. We gathered on the porch as the light went gold and low over the water, the same porch where Margaret had once told me I wasn't blood, though nobody said that out loud, and I don't think anyone needed to. Preston stood near the railing, arms crossed but his face open in a way I hadn't seen from him in 14 years. Lily sat on the steps with her daughter curled against her side. Margaret stood a little apart, near the door, her composure worn thin but still standing, the way a woman stands when she's run out of places to retreat to. I opened the envelope and read Harold's words aloud, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, though it caught once, near the middle, on the line I'd read alone in that gas station parking lot weeks earlier. "I didn't leave you in charge of this place because I felt sorry for you, Walter. I left it with you because you were the only person in this family who ever earned the right to be trusted with something that mattered to me." When I finished, nobody spoke right away. Preston's jaw worked silently for a moment before he looked down at the porch boards, and I watched something in him settle, some old resentment finally exhaling. Lily was crying quietly, the good kind of crying, her daughter watching her with wide, solemn eyes. And Margaret pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something in her face that looked less like control and more like grief, finally allowed to be simple grief instead of a weapon. "He never told me," she said, so quietly I almost missed it. "In 39 years of marriage, he never once told me he trusted someone else more than he trusted me to protect this place." "I don't think it was about trusting you less," I said, and I meant it, because standing there with his letter still warm in my hands, I finally understood something about Harold I hadn't let myself see before. "I think it was about protecting you from ever having to be the one who said no to Preston, or to yourself, when the pressure got bad enough. He put that weight on me because he thought I could carry it without it costing me anything I couldn't afford to lose. I think, in his own quiet way, that was the kindest thing he knew how to do for you." Margaret didn't answer that. She didn't need to. She sat down slowly on the porch swing, and Diane went to her, and for a long moment, mother and daughter simply sat together in a silence that wasn't performance and wasn't strategy. Just two women finally grieving the same man, honestly, in front of everyone, instead of managing the grief into something presentable. In the weeks that followed, the legal side of things resolved with far less drama than the memorial itself had promised. Margaret, once the shock settled, didn't fight the trust. She met with Elliot and signed an acknowledgement confirming she'd been properly informed of the amendment and agreeing not to contest its validity. A formality, Elliot told me, more than anything, since the documents were airtight, but one that mattered to Margaret in its own way, a chance to close the chapter on her own terms instead of having it closed for her. The cabin stayed in the family. I didn't take ownership of it, and never wanted to. I simply held the trustee's authority Harold had given me which was, in the end, exactly what he'd intended. Not control for its own sake, but a steady hand to make sure nobody sold off what mattered most in a moment of grief or greed. Gerald Voss never surfaced again. I heard secondhand that Lakeshore Capital Partners quietly let him go a few months later after a local paper ran a short piece about predatory tactics targeting grieving lakefront families. I didn't feel triumphant reading it. I felt, mostly, relieved that Harold's instincts about the man had been right, the way his instincts about most things usually were. Preston and I have a different relationship now than we did before that reunion. Not close, exactly, but honest, which I've come to believe matters more. He called me unprompted about 2 months later to ask my opinion on a business plan before he sank money into it. I told him the truth, the way I always do, and he thanked me for it, and neither of us made a bigger deal of that small exchange than it deserved. Some repairs don't need ceremony. They just need someone willing to show up and do the work. Deanna and I are still married, still building the slow, careful thing we started 14 years ago, though it looks a little different now. She speaks up now, in rooms where she used to go quiet. She still catches herself sometimes, still studies a floor a beat too long before she remembers to lift her eyes. But she catches herself, and that's the part that matters. We drove up to the cabin again last month, just the two of us, and I found myself standing on that same dock at nearly the same hour of the afternoon, checking my watch out of old habit before I caught myself and simply let the moment be what it was, without filing it away for later. I think about that porch sometimes, on quiet mornings, the way you think about a crack you once found in a beam that turned out, on closer inspection, not to be cosmetic after all. Harold used to say that most structures don't fail all at once. They fail quietly, in small increments, for years, until the day somebody finally puts their full weight down on the wrong spot and the whole thing gives at once. I spent 14 years being the load-bearing wall, in a house that never once thanked me for holding its weight. I don't regret those years. I regret only how long it took me to understand that a wall is allowed to ask, eventually, to be seen for what it's carrying, and that the family worth staying for is the one that finally, honestly, looks